everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us, both in person and online. Thank you for your patience. And thank you so much for being here as we celebrate Albert Samaha's new book, Concepcion, An Immigrant Family's Fortune. My name is Lily Philpat. I'm the Programs Manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. For those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting and supporting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one, run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and publish an award-winning online literary magazine, The Margins. This year, we are turning 30 years old and celebrating our anniversary with a number of programs, which you can check out on our website at aaww.org. I hope you will support the workshop, join our programs, and that we'll see you for 30 more years and beyond. Before I introduce our authors, I just want to quickly thank our event partners. Huge thanks to our friends at Books Are Magic, in particular Michael, who you all met on the way in. He is here with us tonight. You can buy copies of Albert and Matt's books this evening if you have not already, and you can get yours signed after the event as well. If you're watching us online, you can go to the Books Are Magic website and do the same. They will have signed copies online after tonight. I also want to thank Warby Parker for partnering with us and hosting this event in their beautiful garden here in Brooklyn. I want to thank Xavier in particular, Lefogus, Matt, and Nicholas for their assistance. And finally, I want to give a quick shout out to the amazing folks at Riverhead Books, especially Glory and Raven, who are here tonight. They provided some incredible snacks, which I hope you will all partake in. And Riverhead puts such beautiful books out into the world. Please do read everything that Riverhead publishes. We are going to open our event with a reading from Concepcion. I'll introduce Albert and Matt, and then we'll turn the mic over to Albert. We'll do an audience Q&A at the end of the hour, so please do come up with some questions. Albert Samaha is an investigative journalist and inequality editor at BuzzFeed News, whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Village Voice, San Francisco Weekly, and the Riverfront Times, among other outlets. A Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant recipient, he is also the author of Never Ran, Never Will, Boyhood and Football in a Changing American Inner City. This book was a finalist for the 2019 PEN ESPN Literary Sports Writing Award and a winner of the New York Society Library's 2019 Hornblower Award. His most recent book, Concepcion, An Immigrant Family's Fortune, is out today. Matt Ortile is the author of the essay collection, The Groom Will Keep His Name. He is the managing editor of Catapult magazine and a contributing writer at Condé Nast Traveler. Previously, he was the founding editor at BuzzFeed Philippines. He is a McDowell Fellow and has written for Vogue, Self, Out, and BuzzFeed News, among others. Please join me in welcoming Albert and Matt, and put your hands together for Albert.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody being here. I appreciate you guys selling it out. It makes me look really good. For those at home, there's about 900 people in here. Y'all can hear me back there? Good? Okay. Cool. Can I borrow somebody's book? I forgot to bring one. I used to read from it. Thank you, Jessica. All right. I have a couple ideas for what I'm going to read, but any requests from people that have read the book? Any particular passages that you guys liked? Oh, the Disneyland one then. Okay. Which was excerpted in the Paris Review, so if you've already read it, apologies. But it really was one of the funnest vignettes I enjoyed writing, because it kind of has like nothing to do with the rest of the book in some ways. And one of the fun parts about this book was like finding things that on their surface and kind of in my memory were just kind of parts of my life and not really part of the core idea of colonialism and immigration, but then when you think about it, everything's kind of related. If you're an immigrant from a formerly colonized nation, every aspect of your existence is guided and dictated by that fact, including the happiest place on earth. My formative understanding of world events had two acts: the ancient history conveyed in the Bible, and the modern arc approximated at Disneyland, which first opened in Southern California in 1955, 4.5 decades before my first visit. I was 10. My mom and I took a 4:30 a.m. Greyhound bus from Sacramento for the 15-hour ride through the Central Valley, past fruit fields, oil rigs, and speed traps, around the Grapevine Hills, and into Anaheim. My mom slept or prayed the rosary most of the way, while I reviewed our 2-day game plan I'd drawn up on a piece of binder paper, which I kept in my pocket, folded 4 times over for protection. We stayed at a discount Anaheim hotel with a free shuttle to the happiest place on earth, and took the first shuttle out the next morning, arriving before the gates opened. At Disneyland, history starts in the castle at the center of the park. Homage to the glorious medieval years after the bubonic plague wound down, when fair maidens and knights vanquished mysterious evils, while kings and queens conquered the farthest reaches of the known world with Christian God behind them, the Moors in retreat, the seas parting, the age of European discovery dawning. I skipped this Fantasyland stage on the timeline and went straight to Adventureland, the part of the park I was most excited to see. Passing thatched huts with tribal masks at the threshold, I imagined myself an explorer entering the menacing labyrinth of an unfamiliar jungle. It didn't occur to me that I was envisioning myself in the leather boots and beige cotton of a colonial-era European explorer. On the Jungle Cruise ride, the river snaked through sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, as the tour guide at the front noted, the colonized world mashed together into a pastiche of drums, dances, spears, and loincloths. Crates decoratively stacked on the riverbank were stamped Stanleyville, a reference to Henry Morton Stanley, who led a 200-man brigade into the jungle of Central Africa in the 1870s, relying on forced native labor to carry his excessive supplies, killing hundreds on his path through what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, the rubber-rich territory he claimed on behalf of Belgium's King Leopold II. I didn't know Stanley's name then. I was more familiar with Indiana Jones. I had watched all the movies, and I hummed a theme song under my breath as we whipped past giant snakes, poison darts, and bloodthirsty savages on the Indiana Jones ride, my favorite in Adventureland. Rumbling down the track in a make-believe Jeep, I was a professor explorer in the field gathering ethnographic notes to bring back to a campus filled with white students. The history of the West moves west, from Athens to Rome to Paris, across the Atlantic and into the plains. Once independent of Britain, the European settlers in America embarked on an island conquest that would reach the Pacific within a century, statehoods granted at a ferocious pace. Frontierland stood as a living monument to my country's manifestly destined expansion, with a roller coaster set in the mine shafts, a riverboat circling a lake, and a Wild West shooting range. Wearing a felt cowboy hat with Mickey Mouse ears, I imagined myself on a vast barren plain, with tall red rocks casting jagged shadows and tumbleweeds rolling past. I didn't know that the plains hadn't always looked so vacant, that they'd been home to bustling communities until old world diseases ravaged their inhabitants, long before the colonial settlers began their program of massacre and forced relocation. I lived my fantasies through the gaze of the colonizers. The haunted mansion in New Orleans Square was designed to resemble an antebellum plantation. The Pirates of the Caribbean ride featured no apparent Caribbean natives, but rather European outlaws who pillaged the trade ships loaded with gold that paid for enslaved people. In Critter Country, set in the ambiguously old American South, my favorite ride was Splash Mountain, which had a thrilling downhill finale and a cast of animatronic animals from the 1946 movie Song of the South, which is about a Reconstruction-era black servant telling a white child parables about the virtue of resilience in tough times and never running away, an insult to American minorities, deemed Harlem Congressional Representative Adam Clayton Powell. Disney hasn't shown the film since 1986, but it wasn't until summer 2020 that Disneyland would change the ride's theme, its implications at last too blatant to avoid, unlike the more subtle tributes to oppression scattered around. The first part of the park we passed through on our way in, and the last on our way out, was Main Street, USA, an idealized vision of early 20th century small-town America, decked out with ice cream parlors, trolley bells, straw hats, and accordion music. A grotesque phantasm straight from the mind of Walt Disney, the racist, sexist, anti-gay, anti-Semitic, union-busting mastermind behind some of the fondest memories of my childhood. Disney based Main Street, USA on his own hometown, Marceline, Missouri, as he remembered it from his childhood, when it was segregated under Jim Crow era enforcement. For those of us who remember the carefree time it recreates, he said when the park opened, Main Street will bring back happy memories. All around me were the settings for myriad traumas. Thank God I couldn't see any of that, because once you do, you can't unsee it. Pity the child who wanders Disneyland in a haze of despair. In hindsight, the edifice was delicate. When we rode It's a Small World, I scanned the landscape of animatronic child dolls, looking for the one that represented me amid the alleged cultural diversity on display. 12 minutes of Inuit fisherfolk, Nordic ice skaters, lederhosen-clad Germans, British guards with tall black hats, French cabaret dancers, Spanish flamenco dancers, Scots with bagpipes, Dutch girls with blonde pigtails, Italians riding gondolas, Russians in red bonnets, Arabs charming snakes, Indians beside a silhouetted Shiva, Japanese women bowing in kimonos, Chinese acrobats balancing jars, an Egyptian sphinx, sub-Saharan Africans with afros playing drums beside a lion, Mexicans in a sombrero dancing around a bigger sombrero, Peruvians in ponchos on a mountain, white Americans sitting on hay bales, and so on. I nearly jumped out of my seat when I noticed the shirtless brown dolls wearing grass skirts and leafy crowns, who apparently embody South Pacific people at large. As if willing it to be true, I pointed out the generic dark-skinned islanders and said to my mom, "There's the Philippines." On our second time through, I devoted myself to listening closely to the dozens of languages singing, a merry global chorus. No matter how closely I listened, I didn't hear any Tagalog. You can only fit so many cultures in a 12-minute ride. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. And now we have a good friend, Matt Ortile, everybody.
Congratulations,
Thank you.
Kuya.
Thank you.
Kamusta? Good evening, everybody. Another round of applause, please, for Albert Samaha. We did not plan our outfits, and yet we magically coordinated. I dressed like your book.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. No, so happy Filipino American History Month to you, to everybody here, everybody watching. So it is Filipino American History Month. Concepcion is a book of history, national, cultural, familial, colonial, as hard as you can get away from it, to your point, it's all there. Did Riverhead pick this day for you? Or did you pick your launch day?
Oh man, I wish I had the power to pick my launch day.
Yeah?
That is out of my hands. Although I will say, it did sort of happen happenstance. I don't know to what degree it was planned. I'd love to ask my editor, Becky Salacan, publicist, Gloria Plata. But I was going to be late on my deadlines because of the pandemic, and I was supposed to go on book leave summer 2020. Pandemic meant I just wanted to report. And so I was like telling my editor, Becky, I was like, hey, I think I was supposed to file the thing in like November, October 2020. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to make that.
Right.
And she's like, there are way more books coming out in spring 2022 than the fall of 2021.
Yeah.
So it'll help if you made it.
Right.
And so I did, and now it gets to come out on Filipino American History Month. So it worked out well. I didn't plan it, but
Serendipitous.
serendipitous.
Yeah. No, that was the thing about pandemic. My book came out June 2020, and it was like, do we postpone? Do we kick the can down the road? But everyone was like waiting, like either you're like crowded 2021, 2022, but it is a book that is good for the times. It is a book that will stand the test of time because it is, we'll get into the sort of like historical, reported, narrative nature of your work. I think it's this really cool work of reported and research and hybrid memoir. It's like, you guys, when you read this book, because you now have it and you will buy it, everybody who's watching, when you read this book, you will think like, oh my God, this book is something that should be taught in schools. It is something that you sow the history that you go into of the Philippines, of its colonial histories, particularly, the Spanish period and the American periods, that you weave them so seamlessly with your own history as a Filipino-American man. And you mentioned earlier, we were chatting, being a second-generation man, you think of what is home. And I said, Albert, are you going home anytime soon? Thinking he would, the Philippines. And this guy said, oh, to California? So I thought that was a really telling thing, I think, of just kind of the diversity of experiences that we have as Filipino people here in the States. Oh, well, we were also talking a little bit about this earlier. I wanted to ask you here in front of everybody. So this is your second book. So let alone write one book, you wrote two. Never Ran, Never Will, which came out in 2018. How have the pre-publication rights differed between Concepcion and that book?
It's night and day. It actually worked out really well because if I'd gotten like this sort of buzz with my first book, like none of you guys would want to be my friends probably. I would probably be a horrible person with a big old head. But like one of the joys of this process was that I'm really proud of my first book and I love it and it was like a book I will always love. But it didn't get as much attention as this on the come up. And at the time, like anytime you have your first book come out, you sort of imagine every single thing you want to happen happening.
It's like a bingo card of
Right.
like dreams, yeah.
So you don't think about the good things you get. You just think about the good things you didn't get. It's very easy to take things for granted. And so like for like 3 months after the book came out, I was just sort of obsessed with all the things I wasn't getting. But the good thing was it sort of like humbled me. And coming into this process, I was just like, I'm just proud to do this book, and I'm just happy it's here. And I think the thing about this book too was it was just I always wanted to write a story about my family, and I knew I had to do it. And so to me, and I knew I was proud of it, and I knew it was like my best effort at writing of anything I've written. And I was sort of, it sounds corny and it sounds like I'm just saying this to be like chill about it, but it genuinely was like I was just happy that it exists.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, and that was probably the biggest difference. It was like the first time around, it was like, I hope that this elevates my stature in the industry and that, everyone, wants to invite me to pay me a bunch of money to do speaking tours and shit, Whereas for this one, it was just like, I'm glad it exists. And I hope that my descendants read it and learn a little bit about the family that exists now.
Yeah, no, you did such an incredible, like, this is a work of, like, ancestral archival. Like, that's deep stuff that your family, your own family will keep and hold close, but I think the Philippine diaspora, I think, is going to hold this book close for many, many years to come. Speaking of this little family of Filipiness, you are now also welcome to the Yellow Filipino Book Club. I was thinking about this. I was like, oh, great, I love this cover. Yellow is, there seems to be this kind of like little club of Filipino authors, so mine is like this grinder orange yellow, which is appropriate. Gia Tolentino's is like this beautiful marigold. Jose Antonio Vargas has a highlighter yellow. Mia Alvar, from like ages ago, her hardcover is this like dusty aged yellow. How much input did you have on the cover? Because I know that conversation between author, for myself, I'll speak nicely. It was an adventure deciding on a cover, and I wonder, and more frankly, what thoughts do you have on the color of yellow and its associations with Asian identity? E.g. yellow peril, immigration quotas. Like there's so much to kind of go with just the theme of yellow. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, what a fascinating question. In terms of input, man, like I knew it was gonna be good when Riverhead's art people approached me and they're like, send some family photos. And also, if there are any photos of textures that you think capture the book, send that along. I'm like, damn, they're really thinking this through. Like, they really got,
Some of the best people in the business, the folks at Riverhead, yeah.
Yeah. So the process was them saying, hey, here's what we've got. What do you think? And it was this. And I was like,
right away, this was first take.
First one I saw. First one
okay. Ah,
First one
okay.
they showed me.
Yeah.
And it was genuinely better than anything I could have ever imagined. I love it. I love the like, let's just stare at it for a bit. You know what I mean? Like the fact that it's like kind of chopped up and collaged.
Fragmented.
It's like which is very consistent with kind of the structure of the book, which jumps between time and between like artsy stuff and photographic stuff. I like that you can't quite see the faces, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just here's some mystery. I like the colors, you know what I mean? You got the star there. You got this tree right here is an artistic rendering of a coconut tree on my grandmother's farm.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, photo. It's the background on my cell phone right now. And if you've read the book or if you read my essay a couple years ago with BuzzFeed, this is the tree Sargento climbed. And
yeah.
just next to Sargento's in the photo, like just outshot a shot of this. So I thought that was really cool. I'm pretty sure this is Jose Rizal.
That looks like Jose, yeah.
And then this is from an image of a wedding of I don't know, characters that aren't in the book, the wedding. I don't know whose wedding it
But
was.
family
But
members.
family, these are family members. This is Luisa from the book, Lola Isang.
You can see there's a little eye there, right there too.
Yeah, I'm afraid I actually didn't know who this relative is. But this arm is my Uncle Bobby's arm.
Do they know that? Do your family members know that they're on the cover of the book?
Yeah, I told him.
Have they
But when I told my Uncle Bobby he was on the cover, he expected something a lot different than that.
Tito, it's your arm. Braso mo lang.
So yellow, it's such a fascinating question. And so it's funny because and I think part of this is because growing up, I didn't really identify as Asian, right? I identified as, I don't know, I identified as like, I didn't know what I identified as, right? Want to know more, it's in the book. But like, so I never considered myself, I consider myself brown, right?
Totally, yeah.
So when I saw the yellow, my first thought was like, people power. Yellow ribbons.
Yes, Dilawan, yeah.
The yellow, the yellow sun on the flag. And so I was thinking Laban. I was thinking people power.
Ah, there you go.
When for those who aren't familiar, when Ninoy Aquino was he was in exile during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. When he was going to come back on the fated trip that ended with his assassination, all the people went around town, his supporters, and they tied yellow ribbons around the trees. And then after he got killed, yellow was the color of the revolution, the Laban movement. So that was my first. And like his widow, who ended up becoming president, Cory Aquino, she would always wear yellow. So that was my first thought. I was like, oh, yellow, Cory Aquino.
That's smart. Yeah. No, it has become this kind of very Filipino color for us. So obviously, a lot of my questions are about the book-making process, the book-making decisions, but I want to move a little bit towards the craft of your work. So what's been striking to me, I think, is that you, as Albert, you are this incredible reporter. You have this position of like being this professional journalist, right? And now what you're doing is you're turning the lens onto your family history. And so it's a hybrid kind of book, at once memoir, narrative, nonfiction. These are my notes. When I got your galley, I just got back from Vienna, and I was reading this book about the House of Habsburg, which then you also mention in Concepcion, tracing Philippine history all the way back to the Santo Niño, who wears the coat of the Habsburgs on his kind of like green cape, essentially. And I thought this is like up there with like the most sublime, beautifully written narrative nonfiction books ever, and I think it will be something that we will turn to for a very, very long time. Was that always going to be the shape of the book? Did you always know that it was going to be this narrative nonfiction and memoir, or was there ever like you were pulled to one side versus the other?
I was definitely initially resistant to the M word, memoir. You know what I mean? Because growing up as like a journalist, first person, in my head was injected as something that was indulgent. And something like
memoir was indulgent.
Right. Who am I to tell my story when there's millions of other stories in the world to tell? Why is mine more important than anybody,
Totally.
right? So that's sort of drilled into me, internalized in me, So I sort of framed it as, I don't know if anyone's read the book, A Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace, but it's about, this guy writes it about a guy he went to Yale with who ends up getting killed. And the way the book is that the first like half of the book, no first person, just the friend's life, and then when the friend gets to college and meets the writer, you meet the writer, and then you get first person. That was sort of how I was thinking the book. So it was like, okay, you meet my elders, you meet my Uncle Spanky, you meet my mom, and then when I'm born in 1989, here comes first person. But it immediately became clear as I was like working on it that like this is a book from my perspective.
Right.
And that, like, it wasn't just like that. The message that I wanted to convey wouldn't just be conveyed from like it would be disingenuous. It would be disingenuous. It's my story. You know what I mean? It's,
to deny the reader that
Yeah. And I wanted the book. I think one way the book evolved was that I'd initially conceived of it as an immigration story, as an immigrant's tale. But what I realized was it wasn't. It's a second generation story. It's about our generation and looking back on the sacrifices of immigrants.
Totally.
And the questions that I were asking were very second generation questions. And so that way, so from a conceptual aspect, that's how it shaped. And from a sort of practical, technical aspect, very different because the toughest challenge in this book was the structure. Like I messed with that shit. I would like print out drafts, cut it up with scissors on the floor, and like move it around like puzzle pieces because and you guys will see this when you read the book, but the challenge is there's two timelines, right? The timeline from pre-colonial society to the moment in Philippine history when my family leaves, right? The forces that drove the Exodus. Second timeline, or that maybe the first timeline, is when my family arrives and moves to now, right? And so weaving them together, okay, simple enough. We'll do like A, B, right? But
So easy.
well, but the challenge becomes what past and do you pair with the present, right? Like,
Right.
and that's a fundamental question of what idea are you trying to convey. So, like chapter 2, right? It fuses the Magellan's voyage with my uncle Spanky's migration from the Philippines to the U.S., right? Like, so it's this question of I had to align the two timelines both in a way that they maintained their chronological momentum, but also that they had thematic ties between
Right.
them. So there were questions of like, does this scene in timeline A fit better with that scene or that scene in the past? What am I trying to say? So it was very much like a three-dimensional puzzle that took me forever. The idea that my editor Becky Saltan instilled in me that set the course that ultimately ended up in the book is this idea of, a major theme of the book is this idea that as I write, history ripples into perpetuity, right? That everything that happens in history impacts today, right? There's the direct line that weaves and turns and is complicated, but it's a domino effect.
You kind of get a sense of that, like the butterfly that you stepped on then has effects of like
Exactly.
decades, centuries later. Yeah. That's
So,
awesome.
so it became an issue of like, okay, cool. Every chapter will have pieces of timeline A and pieces of timeline B united by a theme that shows how the past impacts the present.
That's great. And so we're talking a little bit about structure here, and I wonder if we can move a little bit to just the kind of what you felt and experienced as the writer turning the lens onto your family. So I have my notes here. I was talking about Concepcion with another fan of yours, Delia Kai from Vanity Fair, who's here in the audience tonight. We were discussing your position as reporter on your family. So could you talk a little bit about the use of reportorial distance from the subject, right? So you alluded a little bit earlier, I'm a journalist. Like, I have to tell somebody else's story, but as well as now you're thinking, your own. How do you play with that kind of assumed distance, that kind of journalistic objectivity, which we know is a little bit bullshit? Just kind of say that, okay. How does it impede or aid the storytelling when you are, like a deputy editor at BuzzFeed News?
I'm the editor now. As of
Oh,
May.
congrats!
Matthew.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I
It's
thought
okay.
it said deputy on
I
it.
well, we gotta update. We'll update for the next one.
Okay.
We can edit this, right?
Okay.
It's a good question. I came in. In some ways, it's especially a good question because it's one I haven't really thought about. Because I kind of came in already with this idea that I'm going to I have my toolbox of skills that I've developed in my career, and I'm going to use those tools to write this story. So I came in planning to write it with the exact same tactics that I used for my first book. And my first book was I embedded in this community in Brooklyn for like 3 years.
You
and, like,
embedded
wrote
in
about
your own family.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And obviously this was a bit easier because I had access to all the sources. I had like a trove of memories that I
Yeah.
could but I think the benefit of just being drilled in the reporter lens is that you don't anyone who's a journalist has heard the phrase like even if your mother tells you I love you, you got to get two sources on that. You know what I mean? You got to confirm it, right? And so that was especially the case for this, right? Where I would hear I would remember things,
Yeah.
and then I would, David Carr did this with his memoir, right, where he would report out his own memoir by interviewing his friends and relatives. So I did that, right? So I wanted to get that perspective, and I think one of the ways I had to figure out how to apply that in writing was that I wanted this to be I wanted this to reach like levels of journalistic standards that I have for any other story, but like with journalism, sometimes you can't get to the truth.
100.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's a part of my book where I talk about my grandmother Rosalina's visa situation.
Oh, yeah.
you know? And the lore in my family was that she, that like her green card had expired for complicated reasons, but she wanted to come to the States anyway. So she comes to the States on tourist visa and then like overstays it and is basically undocumented. And then while she's living in San Francisco undocumented, she gets mugged. They steal her purse, this mugger, and when the police come and take a police report, they ask her what was in the purse. She's like, oh man, my green card was in the purse. I needed that. And they filed it, and then they got a replacement green card, and it came in the mail. And all of a sudden, like magic, she's documented. what an amazing story. And the beauty of the story is that she's mugged because she's in a high crime neighborhood because we've been segregated into these neighborhoods. So I love this irony of like, you know, America has pushed us into the forgotten corners of their country only for that forgottenness to lead to our legitimacy, right?
Yeah, you hack the system.
Right. And then my mom was like, man, that's not true. And I was like, what? Well, are you sure? You know? Because I heard that story from one auntie, and my mom was like, no, you know, Grandma wouldn't do that. And I was like, well, that sucks. This was a great story I wanted to
You
use.
ruined that part of the book.
Right. And so what does journalists do? They get the public records. So I FOIA'd my grandmother's immigration file. I got it. It was like 32 pages, and it didn't answer the questions, right? It had evidence that suggested the lore could be true, but nothing confirming the lore. And I didn't know. So I sort of handled it the way we would handle it in like a BuzzFeed story edit, which is like, well, this side says this side says that, and then here's the documentation, and here's what it says.
You can hold space for like all of these truths to exist at the same time. Yeah.
And then it becomes part of a device because a big part of the book is like, what is history? What is truth? Who tells it? Who controls it? And in this book, I control it. So what are our responsibilities as storytellers? You know?
I love this.
And I wanted,
so good.
and I wanted to be a responsible storyteller. And so even when it came to like, well, it could make the narrative a little weaker. Actually, sometimes complicated stories make narratives a little more stronger.
100%. When you introduce the kind of complication or the thing that you run up against, it like makes the thing so much more unique and so much better for it. I mean, I think you mentioned foying your grandmother. Like you have this, like, you mentioned a toolbox that a lot of other, I'll use the M word if I may, memoirists may not have. So it's interesting, it's really cool to kind of apply your very Albert take on this story. And I think if a lot of folks here will have, and people tuning in will be very aware of like who gets to tell a certain story, who gets to say what about something, and who owns a story. So I think you applying those kinds of techniques to the work is very, very, very special, very cool. So thinking a little, Leaf.
He's been out of the Philippines like
I know.
10 years and already
I know.
nature is.
This is too much. I can't. Hindi ko kaya. So when we report something, right, I often find that no matter how much you prepare or do your research, there's always something that can surprise you. Sometimes you want to leave room to be surprised with a topic like your own family. I wonder if there was something that really, really surprised you and you were like, oh man, I did not expect that at all. And, you know, is that something that you're still processing? Or, you know, the question is a little bit about like, we kind of have narratives that we expect even before we go into a story, but part of our work is to kind of be as open as possible to everything. Could you tell me a little bit about like maybe something that kind of did catch you off guard?
Yeah, so I always, you know, believed, assumed, knew that the sort of inflection point that sparked our exodus from the islands was the dictatorship, right? We were anti-Marcos, you know, relatives of mine were part of like the opposition to him, and you know, my grandfather refused to pay bribes, and so his legal practice eroded and his business eroded. My grandmother's best friend was the sister of a Congress member who was arrested when martial law started, and so she and her friend quit their jobs at the Philippine Central Bank at a protest. So like, oh, of course they bounced. You know what I mean? Like that's very complicated. And so in 1978, my grandmother goes to San Francisco, and it was okay. So the plan was my grandmother goes to San Francisco, settles things down while my grandfather stays in Manila and, you know, looks over the household. All makes sense. But then when I started reporting it, I was like, yeah, you know, that's what happened, right? And a couple of aunts were like, well, yeah, mostly. But also, your grandmother found out your grandfather was having an affair and had a secret family. And
Sounds right.
And they sort of weren't the same after that, and she wasn't as invested in them staying together, right? So it's like this, and this is how life is, right? Is that like, we like to boil down these simple truths into just kind of uncomplicated narrative, where it's like, martial law leads to our exodus, very good for writing. But now it's like, well, what does this affair say about colonialism? How can I, you know what I mean? How does this fit into the narrative?
Yeah, how can I?
And it doesn't, right? It's just something that exists. And And so like you write it in. And like, yes, martial law played a role, right? Like they lost their jobs, they lost their incomes, they were going to leave. But would they have left together? Would they have gone somewhere else? How would the circumstances have changed if not for that particular personal issue? And you know, obviously that was like a detail that I didn't grow up hearing, obviously. And I don't think I think I had like, I might have heard some existence in the past that there was a second family, but I didn't know the timing. I didn't know it happened in 1972, 3 months before martial law happened. So there was no untangling those two facts. They both happened, and who's to say which played a bigger role in what happened next?
Totally, yeah. Sometimes we think of certain things being a strict cause and effect, but sometimes causation, correlation, etc. I was just rambling, right? But you know what I mean.
True, yeah.
We do want to leave some time for some questions from the audience. And will we be fed questions online at all, or no? Maybe not. Okay.
You could DM me. I have my phone right here. So feel free
Listen,
to
you
DM me
were
if you have
invited to slide into Albert's DMs.
with questions about the book and literature.
All right. Well, I won't make it weird for you. We'll do that later when we got drinks. But while people, does anyone have a question already? Because I have like one more to buy time. But anyone? There's a question right there.
Yeah, so how forthcoming were your family members with actually telling stories? And do you think that part of the reason why integral like collective history was to fill in some gaps? Or
I was blessed. Some are more forthcoming than others. Some were like, I support you, I love you, but I don't really want to talk about this. But I had plenty of family members who were willing. I mean, like, you know, my family, like a lot of Filipino families, love to chismis. We love to talk. We love to gossip about one another. So they're very supportive. You know, I learned how to tell stories from my mom, from my families. We're always talking. Like I was always up to date growing up about the affairs in our household because I was like eavesdropping my mom talking on the phone with her sisters. So they were very supportive of the project. I've like published some essays and done some like piecemeal work that they saw, and I think that when they saw that, they were like, oh, cool. He's like, this is cool. He's doing this justice. This is a fun project.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's helpful.
and so I think that helped support them. But also, like, again, like one of the reasons this was easier than a lot of other books is because like my family loves me and they're very supportive. And at the bottom line, like the reason they talked to me more than anything else was because I asked them to. You know, like it wasn't about like necessarily we support you on Believe in Product. It's like, oh yeah, what do you want to know? And obviously, you know, I corroborate things, and you know, our memories are imperfect, so I make sure the story was right. But I was very, I mean, like there's a history of this in my family. My great auntie Caridad, she wrote a trilogy of oral histories chronicling Filipino immigration. My great uncle Tomas, he wrote a memoir where he chronicled like his life in Italy when he believes he was like the only Filipino in Rome. So I think like they existed. So when I came to my family with this project, they sort of they're like, oh cool, like Grandpa Andy, you know what I mean? Like they had a framework in their mind, and but above all, they just wanted to support me. So that made this a lot smoother because I talk to people who do memoirs and who do family stuff, and it's not so easy, and there's complicated stuff, and they have people who resist it, and they're worried that when it comes out, everyone's gonna hate them. And I was very blessed that my family's been very supportive through this process.
That's awesome. The question we'll repeat questions so that folks online can hear, but the question was how forthcoming were your family members were, and it sounds like they were pretty open. All you gotta do is ask sometimes, right? Yeah, that's great. There's a question back there, Aaron.
You spoke a little bit about the processes between your first and second book, how they differed, how they repeated, but I'm curious, are there any themes that overlap between one and two?
The question was, are there themes that that occur between your first book and this book, as different as they are?
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that recently, and 100%. Family, I think, is the number one thing that overlaps. That first book was a book about families, and about families figuring out how to navigate forces beyond their control. I mean, you know, colonialism and imperialism generally, you know, I mean, it's different kinds, right? It's imperialism against a nation across the ocean versus imperialism against your own people in your own country. and navigating that. Um, and I think kind of this idea of like the come up, of striving. The characters in the first book were kids, and I followed a youth football team in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and it was kids that were trying to use this brutal sport to escape their circumstances. So it was also about sacrifices, and it also sort of reckoned with what is the cost of sacrifice. What is the, what sacrifices do you have to pay in order to elevate? And why do some people have to pay those sacrifices and other people not have to pay those sacrifices? And I think that kind of core concept of who has to sacrifice, who doesn't, and what is that sacrifice is probably the overarching theme between those two books.
Thanks for that. Anyone? Bianca.
Hi. What was your relationship with the Filipino language before the book, and did that change at all during the process and after?
The question was, what was your relationship to Filipino language?
Yeah, it didn't change. It always felt blurred lines, like kawawa, chismis, naks naman, pasalubong. Like I didn't like associate these words as being part of a different language. They were just part of my vernacular. And I knew I didn't speak Tagalog, and I couldn't because all of my relatives spoke, my elders spoke it, and I knew that I couldn't speak that, but I understood fluently. And I've understood Tagalog fluently since my earliest memories of eavesdropping on my mom on the phone, And so I'd always had this like, it was kind of this, I guess the complicated part of the relationship was that I've always sort of wanted to learn Tagalog and know it, but I've also kind of run up against like the practicality of like, there's never a situation where I need to use it out of necessity, right? Like in the Philippines, I can speak English and get by. And so it's like, well, if I'm gonna learn language, might as well learn like French, Spanish, Arabic, something that, but I've always sort of regretted that. And I've always sort of regretted not being completely fluent in Tagalog. And I think maybe if anything, this book made me think about that more and reckon with my relationship with that language. And because, if anything, this book really underscored for me how big a part Tagalog words are in my life. I hadn't really thought about like, I just say tabiapo every time I go outside, so like, or peragaba, when something bad happens. And I hadn't realized that so many Tagalog words were infused in just my daily vernacular until I sat down and write it. I'm like, oh man, there are a lot of Tagalog words in this book. And so it's a constantly evolving relationship, I think.
Yes, question.
Hi, where your family was really helpful in helping you figure out histories of what happened. Do you find that same fluidity in discussions about colonialism and its impact psychologically, or how it manifests in culture and practice? Because I know in my family, that's a place that's really important to discuss.
Talking about colonialism with your family, how was that?
I mean, I don't think we talked about that. I talked about my mom more than anyone. I didn't really get their thoughts too much on the deep history. It would come up here and there, but, and I mean, I guess this goes back to the kind of like the journalist in me, where it's like you focus when you interview your sources on what do they know best, and what is the thing that they, like, this is always the thing when I tell the reporters I work with, where it's like you'll have a source have this amazing quote, like, oh man, this company screwed so many people over, they fired everybody. I'm like, oh cool, how do they know? It's like, oh well, their brother used to work for the company. I'm like, well then we can't quote them, you know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of like that. So I think that's the reason it never really came up. But with my mom, we talked about it a lot, especially when the statues were getting taken down, because I was curious because, she's a Trump supporter. She's into QAnon. I know my mom's watching. Hi, Mom. Love you. And I wasn't sure where she would land on the statues, right? Because it's not necessarily overtly like a Republican Democrat issue on its face. And so we would debate like what it means to take the statues down and what it means to reckon with history. And she had a nuanced perspective on that, where she wasn't just like, it's terrible, they're all terrorists, but it was more like, history is history. And she sort of was against this idea of trying to erase things that we had put up as part of history. And, I would argue, well, but only one side was put up, and, there were many statues that didn't get made. And we would talk about it like that, but that was kind of really the extent of it. With my other uncles and aunties, we kind of just talk about their memories, their experiences, and didn't delve as much into the stuff. But after they read this book, though, I'd be very curious to discuss it with them.
Go ahead, yeah. So when you would interview your family, would they? So first, let's ask: would they answer you in English, Tagalog, a combination?
Combination.
Right.
Combination,
So,
Taglish.
so sort of that working with Taglish, which almost feels like its own language in its own way. There's all its own grammatical rules almost. Was anything you feel? How did you do that kind of adaptation work, translation work? What did you find was lost in moving everything into English? What was gained? Tell us about that.
I just used the Tagalog words. The places where that particular, if there was a quote with a Tagalog word or phrase, I would just leave it in. And people can figure it out in the context, or they can look it up, you know? Or if you know Tagalog, then you get the joke, you know? So that was my solution, is that we we adopt into our English language so many words that aren't from like Anglo-Saxon, whatever, right? Like patio and canyon are Spanish words, kindergarten, German, menu, French, right? So like, yeah, Kawawa, Pasalubong, but like Bayan, you know what I mean? Like, there's
Boondock, I think.
Boondock. That's
Yeah.
one that got mainstream.
Technically,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So to me, it was an issue. I was like, if there's going to be some loss in translation, it's going to be between my book and the people that don't speak Tagalog or care to understand it. And I would always make sure, like, like, that the context would be clear enough, you know? Like, I think the first time I say Kawawa, I would just say, like, this happened, and, this bad thing happened to him, and he wasn't sure what to do, so he just stood there looking all Kawawa. And, like, y'all who don't know what Kawawa means can probably figure out what it means from the context.
Yeah.
So my solution was to try to just frame it with context that would at least help people that didn't know what the words meant get a general sense of it.
Any more questions live? Go for it. Emma O'Connor in the back.
Hi. I was wondering if there was anything you pushed in the book that was particularly scary for you, either because it was like personally revealing or because you were worried about how your family would react.
Were you scared of putting anything in the book, and what was that thing?
Yeah, I mean, my mom and I talk a lot about, like, the financial trouble stuff.
Right.
'Cause
And you open with it.
How's that?
You open the book with
I
it.
opened
Yeah.
the book with it. Because, my family, and maybe other Filipino families too, we don't like to dwell on the bad stuff. We're very, like, some bad happens, you smile and laugh your way through it, And I try to inject that in the book as much as possible, this idea of, like, kind of dark humor. But that was the part that, like, people always assume it's like the Trump stuff and the QAnon stuff my mom has a problem with, but she doesn't. She's proud, you know what I mean? Like, she believes in this. Why wouldn't she? You know what I mean? Like, of course you can put it in. But it was like, it's something that's, like, very private, And, like, a lot of her friends don't know some of the details in the book. Some of our relatives don't know some of the details in the book. And so that was the part that, like, we really had to, like, talk through and talk about, like, how are we going to frame this? What's the context? Obviously, my mom read the whole book before we published it, as did, like, one of my cousins, just to, like, fact check and just to make sure I wasn't, like, saying anything out of turn. So, like, there were some details that I was like, that, folks requested I take out, and those details, if they weren't relevant enough to the story, I would take it out. It's like, yeah,
Okay.
it's not a big deal. It's not worth a debate. But if they were relevant to the story, then we would talk it through and be like, why do you feel this way?
Right.
Here's why I want to use it. Here's why I don't think you should be embarrassed by this. Like, my mom's, like, bankruptcy was one of those things. She was like, do we really mention the bankruptcy? And I was like, well, look, man, like, millions of others. You were not the only one in 2009. You know what I mean? And, like, just trying to explain that, like, this is, like, we should be talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
We should not stigmatize these troubles that are caused by, like, the systems of oppression,
Yeah.
right? And that by stigmatizing it, we sort of give it a power that it shouldn't have. And that was sort of the argument I gave for why the financial stuff was important, because other people reading the book or whatever have gone through the same thing. And I thought it was important for that experience to be represented
Right.
just as much as like Filipino culture needs to be represented.
Because otherwise it could be totally forgotten. Like the less that we talk about some of these taboo things or things that might feel shameful or, nakakahiya, right? That kind of very particular Filipino sense of shame. If you don't record it, you don't archive it, that is completely erased and, you wonder where it comes from. No, it's been happening. So it sounds like you shared the book with your family, but didn't give them veto power. Like no absolute
No, I mean, but it's like, family, right? So it's like I didn't have to make the same sort of like obviously I would never share a draft with a source for journalism, right?
Did you
This is
send
a
your
very
family a no
exceptional case.
surprises letter?
I mean, that was what I just gave them the book.
That's
The version
true.
of
Yeah,
that,
that's
right?
it. Yeah.
And I guess technically they did not have veto power, but if any of them felt strongly about not including a detail, I mean, it's my family. You know what I mean? If
Yeah.
you burn a source, you burn a source and you move on. But if it's family, you got to live with it. And
Yeah.
I wanted them to be proud of this book. I wanted them to be happy and support the
Right,
book.
right. You want to be able to have them share it.
Exactly, exactly. So in that sense, I wanted to be generous and open to their feedback.
I think that's all the time we have. But before we go, do you want to share anything with the audience? Just anything you want to say?
Thank you all. This feels really good to just be talking about this, to see you guys in person. Really appreciate you guys getting tickets mad early, all 900 of you in this stadium.
I think 100 more just showed up during the whole
man.
thing. I think it's
Hit
1,000
grand.
now.
Cool,
Oh my
cool.
God.
But yeah, I mean, shit, we're gonna be around. We'll probably get drinks somewhere afterwards, happy to chat. I mean, one of the benefits of a small crowd is dang it,
1,000 is small for Albert, you guys. Albert's used to selling out Madison Square.
But one of the benefits of an intimate crowd like this is that we could all chat. You know what I mean? Come up to me. It's not if there actually were 800 people here, then it's all right, see y'all, hit me up. You can email me. But don't be shy. Happy to chat. Happy to sign books. They got Matt's book too. It's a great book. The groom will keep his name, so please get that. Get all the yellow books you can. And yeah,
It'll make your shelves look really good.
thank you for everybody watching. Thank you. Sorry I couldn't make it, but glad that you're watching. Hope to just see everybody chat. And that's all I got. You got anything else?
No. Congrats to Albert, everybody. Give him a round of applause. Congratulations on Concept
The one thing I do want to add. When people ask me what do you think you want people to take from the book, which is always such I would never really like that question, but because I don't know, but
You'll say it now.
But I'll say it now because I thought about it because someone asked me that recently, and my favorite line of the book is when I say that my family story is one thread in a vast tapestry, and this book isn't about the Filipino American experience. This book is about the Concepcion family, and the one thing I learned is that everybody has stories in their family, you know what I mean? And there were stories in my family that I didn't know about till I started going on this book. So there's plenty of room for every experience under the sun. Every voice needs, you know what I mean? So ask if you have a family story, ask learn your family history, ask your elders these things. It was such an enriching process just to talk to my elders about their lives and to learn about them. Even if I wasn't doing the book, it still would have been so meaningful and important to do. So that's the one thing. It's just that I urge everybody to just explore your own family histories, find out where you came from, write about it, and make a little money if you can. But explore that history, because we all come from kind of a particular experience, and none of our individual threads are the same. And the more threads that we can record for history, the less will be erased. So that's all. Thank you, everybody.
Congrats to Albert.
You guys did such a wonderful job wrapping it up. I do actually have one final question, though. We try and end our workshop events with doing what I say is sort of calling absent friends into the space. So I'd love to ask both of you Filipino writers you'd like to recommend that our audience should read. A couple names each, if you have them.
Elaine Castillo's America's Not the Heart was probably the first piece of literature I'd read that I related to and that I saw myself in. That was the first book when I was telling all my Pinoy friends, yo, you gotta read this. So if you haven't read America is Not the Heart, I love that book and I was always gonna recommend it. There's a lot of overlap in terms of it was also Bay Area Filipino American, and I just it really hit me close. Mia Alvar that you mentioned, In Our Country, love that it's a short story collection, and it's a full tapestry of like you get the overseas workers, you get like she has this amazing story of like that's like the last story, the one where she reimagines Nino Aquino and like the fate and Corey and his fate, which and I was like, man, is this all true? Is this fictionalized? It's just amazing. So those are the two books that come to mind that like really um, inspired me. And also, sorry, this is the last one. And Carlos Bulosan, of course, if you haven't already, America is in the Heart, which Elaine based her title of, which to me, in like my, egotistical mind, I like it like kind of set as like a forerunner, as like a book that I wanted my book. My ultimate dream is that people will think of my book one day the way we think of Bulosan's book as like a chronicling of a moment in time. So those three books are probably the three that I loved and influenced me a lot.
I'll be quick. I'll recommend Meredith Talusan's book, Fairest, which came out last year. Talusan is a trans writer, Filipino immigrant, an albino, and so occupying a really interesting intersection of identities, passing as white, and so, and also she has this amazing, huge chunk of the book is about growing up in the Philippines as a child star, right? And it's really great stuff. And for me, as a queer Filipino as well, like Meredith, who we work with at BuzzFeed, as a disclaimer, it was one of the people who showed me that like we can tell our stories in all of our intersections and all of our colors. So highly recommend all of these authors. I echo you on Elaine and Carlos.
I'm sure you guys already have bought like Gia and Jose's book anyway, so we don't have to shout them out. But they're also fantastic, and I love both of their books. So Gia Tolentino's, Jose Antonio Vargas, so many. Grace Tillerson.
A lot of Filipino, Grace
Lottie
Talusan
Favors.
as well. Yeah, like there's lots of Filipinos everywhere. We're here if you just look, just ask, and we will tell you where our work is.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. Just a very quick note about signing. Michael from Books Are Magic is in the back of the garden. Please buy a copy of Albert's book, Matt's book, if you don't have them already. Albert is actually going to hang out on stage and we'll sign them for you, or they both will sign them for you. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Please, another round of applause. And thank you.
Thank you.
Albert, are you going to perform something from BSD in Hong
Oh shit, we could get some. Mic still work? We get some jams. What's the neighborhood code here? Are we 8 p.m.?
Are you
We're
okay
good.
on like?
We get some,
Oh, you have a playlist?
yeah, man, you didn't see I tweeted it to you.
It works, yes!
A little background music, signing.
I'm getting it a finished copy.
Very well.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I'm sorry, I got held up in meetings. Yeah. I would love to buy a drink. I'm sure everyone here will. So, yeah. And I'll let you go to your signing thing. Oh my god, yeah.
How are you doing? What you guys doing? You've been before, right, Captain?
Well, just
Yeah.
yeah. I was just wearing not wearing
So let's say it's
full theme with your green. I'm so eager to read this one. Congratulations on the reviews. I'm sure people already. Yeah. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
So have you done the signing?
No, we'll be. Yeah. No, I think I'm just here.
Whenever you're ready, you first.
By the way, I must ask, but were you behind the General Luna and the on Netflix?
What about it?
That is being on Netflix?
No, the guys did I think I don't think but I know, and you were here, I'm like, here, wherever it is that you want to. And I'd love to share my backyard also. I know you have another one.
Anytime.
It's fun with This is my first in-person book event in so long. It's amazing. No, but it's actually it's so beautiful. Me neither. Oh, I got it.
I'm glad we got it for a little bit.
Oh, I didn't know
Optimistic.
Optimistic?
Yeah. He's happy. We should try to put it on again.
Is this the line?
I think so.
Okay, cool.
Also, I think people like me want you to
Oh,
sign.
okay.
I don't have a pen though.
We have.
Oh, okay, good. Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Albert.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you.
Congratulations. This is such a good talk.
Oh, you can never tell because in a moment I'll have it so fast.
It was great.
How do you spell your name?
Hannah. H-A-N-N-A-H. Me? Dina. Oh. Nice to meet you. I like. It's so weird with seeing people like not on the internet or it's just like crazy time.
When was the last book event you went to?
I mean, I don't even know. Like it must have been early 2020. Yeah.
My last one was Kevin Wing's New Waves also at Booster Magic. Oh my god, of course.
It's really
Thank
great
you.
to be able to get this signed.
Of course.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, Anna.
Albert.
Good to meet you.
Great interview.
I appreciate it. You too, you too.
Thanks. It's good when you do it with friends.
That makes it a lot easier. Oh, yeah, no problem. Thank you. What's your name?
Pardon me. Sorry. And again,
Are you a writer as well? Are you a writer as well?
I mean, I've mostly written some for the
Oh, amazing. Margins. Yeah, awesome. Congratulations. Let this be inspiration.
I appreciate that. You too. Hello. How are you?
Because I remember
You all went by so fast.
cover. It's actually the cover that I wrote.
Good? That's good. How do you spell your name?
No, that's just it.
Behind you. Try and get to the
Thank you. No, no. Thank you for your charity.